Well, thankful for Mike and Hannah for leading the singing and playing the piano. Those are two very important jobs in the church. And Mike, you did a good job. You did a good job.
Hannah did a good job. I just feel
Hannah helped.
Hannah was the only reason we did that. That's the way to do it.
Yeah. It's for those of us that have very limited musical ability, which is me. Trying to lead singing without music is a challenge. So, and I have had to try to do it a time or two. It's tough for me. Well, as always, I appreciate being at Pisgah. This is home away from home for me. I always will be. I know my thoughts this morning, some of them at least. Don't know that I know exactly. Sometimes preaching, if any of you youngsters are ever called to preach, the hardest part is the first few sentences. Then after you kind of get into it, it kind of comes. Usually, it kind of flows, but sometimes it's kind of hard to get started. But I'm going to start like this morning. I will say this. God got all over my sermon in Sunday school this morning, but that's okay. Didn't bother me a bit. So really, this is just going to be kind of a continuation of the Sunday school class. I guess is kind of where I'm headed. But there was a lady born in 1820 by the name of Fanny Crosby. Some of you may be familiar with that name because she wrote some over 1,000 gospel hymns that were published in her lifetime. And when she was 6, if you want to read a history on Fanny Crosby, when she was 6 weeks old, she was hit with a disease that caused her eyes to become infected. In 1820, of course, medical conditions were quite different than they are now. And so her parents, trying to do the right thing for her, put a poultice on her eyes. Some people will tell you that poultice caused her to go blind at 6 weeks old. Some people say it was inevitable. She was going to go blind anyway. I don't know. Anyway, at 6 weeks old, Fanny Crosby was blind and was blind from that point forward. She was asked one day if what she would give to get her eyesight back. And her answer was something like this, and not nearly as poetic as her answer was. She was a terribly gifted and talented lady, and I'm going to read a little bit of one of her songs here just in a minute. But she said something to the effect of, even if I could have my eyesight back, I wouldn't take it, because it might the beauty of the world might distract me from my love of God. And that's real close to what she said. I may have not worded that just exactly right. And so she accepted her condition of blindness graciously, and in fact she embraced it. And remembering this now, so living in 1820, 6 weeks old and blind, at 6 months old her father died. And there's more to her history. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, look up Fanny Crosby sometime. But in some of the songs that she wrote. But here's one that she wrote, and I'm just going to read the first verse. And what I want to do is I want you to think about this young lady who was basically blind from birth. I seriously doubt if you could see until you're 6 weeks old and then go blind that you, as an older person, that you remember anything that you saw. It's my understanding that most children don't really have historical memory until they're approaching 3 years old. If somebody here remembers something in your childhood before you were 3, that's great, but that's what most people will tell you. So I doubt if she remembers ever being able to say. One more thing I want to tell you that she said too, and about, would you take your eyesight back? This is an important part. And she said, no, because I might let the beauty of the world distract me from my love of God. She also said, think how wonderful it's going to be that the first face I ever see in my life is the face of Jesus. Pretty good way of making lemonade out of lemons. Turning a negative into a positive. She wrote Blessed Assurance. So, try to understand if you can and put yourself in her shoes. And I'm not going to preach about Fanny Crosby this morning, but this is part of my thoughts. If you could put yourself in her place and still be able to write these words, and it's on page 25 if you want to look at it. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. You know, this is about the only church I ever go to that I have trouble with my emotions. I don't know what it is, but it hits me here almost every time. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Heir, in other words, I'm going to inherit. Heir of salvation, purchased of God. And her salvation was purchased of God. Born of His Spirit. Washed in His blood. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day long. That is one amazing lady. So with that backdrop, with those thoughts in your mind, and if you'd like to read with me, feel free to. Turn to 2 Kings, 4th chapter, starting with the first verse. It says, there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elisha, saying, Thy servant my husband is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord, and the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. And Elisha said unto her, What shall I do for thee? Tell me, what hast thou in the house? And she said, Thine handmaid hath not anything in the house, save a pot of oil. In other words, other than a pot of oil. Then he said, Go, borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. And when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons, and thou shalt pour unto all those vessels which thou shalt set aside that which is full. So she went from him and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass that when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, Bring me yet a vessel. And he said unto her, There is not a vessel more. And the oil stayed or stopped. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, Go, sell the oil, and pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children of the rest. So that's the first 7 verses of this 4th chapter of 2 Kings. A story concerning the prophet Elisha. And I guess if I wanted to title a sermon this morning, it would just be the name of the song, Blessed Assurance. Now the word assurance means that we have an absolute steadfast hope that something is going to turn out okay. It's not insurance, it's assurance. A-S-S-U-R-A-N-C-E. We're confident that it's all's going to be okay. Now I don't know at what point or what level of confidence this woman had at the beginning of this story here. She probably was quite discouraged, in fact. And I'll say this, and it was touched on in Sunday school a fair amount, and even in this service since then as well, with prayer requests and so on. But those of us that have lived several years realize the reality of this, that there has been a point in our lives that you hit rock bottom. I don't know what causes it, but something causes it. whatever, and it was touched on, was it Beth, Mike? Somebody in Sunday school mentioned all these things that can cause, maybe even Marilyn, I don't remember, mentioned in Sunday school all these things, whether it be finances or children or health or relationships or whatever it is. But something will cause that. Now, a lot of us are hoping and praying that we've already hit rock bottom and we're not going to hit it again. But there's no guarantee that that's the case. For you youngsters, I'm not trying to be pessimistic about your future and about your life, but just understand the day is coming that you're going to feel like you don't have a friend in the world. And you're going to feel like life can't get any worse than it is right now. Now, I would dare say that along about this time right here, about this woman that we read about in 2 Kings, that probably was what she was feeling, that life just can't get any worse than it is right now. What we find there is we find a woman who was a good woman, a religious woman. She was married to a man who the Bible says was part of the school of the prophets that was taught by Elisha. And so what that was back in the old ages, their Old Testament times, was simply today it's referred to as minister school. And yes, I've been to minister school, and I hope you don't frown upon that, because I'll tell you, it didn't do a thing to change my God calling from above that I was called to preach. But it did help me talk to other preachers and study some scripture. And I mean, it was nothing but a wonderful and a good thing. But regardless of that now, so this man was a part of minister school, if you will. But for whatever reason, God saw fit to take him out. And so that left just the widow and her two, I believe there was two, sons there that was there. And I want you to understand that in this time in history now, that when a widow was left alone without a man, she was really up against it in a tough spot. Because there weren't any jobs out there for women. Nothing to do. And not only was she left without her husband to provide for her, but he also left her in debt to her debtors. And I don't know how much, what it was, or anything about it. But in those days, you can go back and look and read in the book of Leviticus if you want to. And Leviticus will tell you about how that if somebody owes you money, that you had the moral, I'm not going to say moral, you had the legal right to take their children and enslave them and make them, force them to work off the debt of their parents. So that's the situation we find ourselves here. The debtor came to her house and said, you either pay your debt or I'm going to take your sons and I'm going to enslave them until you can pay off your debt. Well, think about that for a minute. If it's not even their debt. And how long will it take? And will the guy that puts them in his service be fair to them? There's lots of questions. There's lots of room for things to be abused in that situation there. And not only that, that would leave her totally alone, absolutely hopeless and helpless. And that's the situation she finds herself in now. I don't know what your situation has been. I don't know what your situation is today. Some things were mentioned in Sunday school. A lot of it I was not familiar with, and it's none of my business. I don't need to be familiar with it, because what I do know is I do know that we can have a blessed assurance in God, our Father from above. There's just no doubt in my mind about it. One of the reasons I know it for a fact is because I've been there and I've done that. I've been through it. I've been through the low part. I've been through it just as low as I felt like, as the saying goes, I felt lower than a snake's belly at times. And yeah, I've been there, and I try to be pretty upbeat most of the time. I try to be a glass half full kind of guy, and I am. It just kind of comes natural for me to be that way. But there's times now that I didn't know what I was going to do tomorrow. Lord, everything in the world is going wrong. I'll be with this church, well, with most churches, kind of my personality, but especially with this church, I know you so well, I am an open book. So I will tell you that when I was trying to pastor a church and go through a divorce because my wife left me, I couldn't have got much lower. But I had to pick myself up every Sunday morning and go preach a sermon. And you know what? And don't feel sorry for me. That's not how I mean it. But I'm just telling you now, life happens. And sometimes it's tough. And that was tough on me. Toughest part of my entire life was that right there. Toughest portion of life I've ever been through. Now, I may go through a tougher portion even yet. I don't know. I might. It could very well happen. And if I do, I'll pray that I'll have enough faith to hold on and know that God will see me through it. He might not keep you from the trial, folks, but He'll see you through the trial. You can rest assured. But anyway, let's get back to the woman here and her son. So anyway, Her husband died. She was getting ready to lose her children, but to the creditor to take her 2 sons to the bondman. And now Elisha, she called for the man of God. At least she knew where to turn to. She called for Elisha to come. And Elisha came to her, and when he asked her there, he asked her 2 really important questions that sometimes we need to ask ourselves. His first question was, and I'm going to change the wording a little bit to make it more in today's language, but he says, "What do you need?" Now, King James Version says, "What shall I do for thee?" But basically what that boils down to is, what do you need? Second question. What hast thou in the house? All right. What do you need and what do you have? 2 questions he asked her there. If I were asking it today, that's how I would phrase it. What do you need and what do you have to accomplish or fulfill your needs? Well, sometimes we have to get ourselves out of the way. Sometimes before God will intervene in our lives, and I'm not, if there's somebody here today that's going through something horrible or just really got you beat down or whatever the case might be, no way am I accusing anybody of being in this situation. But sometimes I have been in this situation, so I know it can happen. It's human nature to try to fix things ourselves. So Elisha asked her 2 questions there to try to get her attention, if you will, and maybe see her situation for exactly how it was. What do you need? Lord, I need a miracle is what I need. Have you ever been in this spot where you just felt like you needed a miracle? Yes, I have. I have. Yes, she did. I need a miracle is what I need. The creditors are going to come and they're going to take my children, and then they expect me to pay the debt or them to pay off the debt, and I'm by myself, and I'm just going to keep racking up debt and debt and debt. You know what she could have done? She could have gone and found another creditor and borrowed more money. Would that have worked? No. She could have just given up and quit. Would that have worked? No. And then he said, "And what do you have?" She said, "Elisha, all I've got is this little bitty flask or pot of oil." And I dare say that pot of oil was in her house because of who and what her husband was. Because he was one of the sons of the prophet. So therefore, I strongly suspect that he anointed people with oil. That was part of their religious process in those days. And that's probably why that little cruse of oil was in her house. But anyway, what do you need? What do you have? Sometimes you have to look at those questions and answer those questions to understand and fully realize that my needs are great and what I've got is almost nothing. So Lord, what am I going to do? You know, do you remember back, and I don't know if everybody went through this or not before you got saved, but I remember the last words I remember saying before I got saved was this, is because I looked at it and I thought, what do I have? I don't have anything right now. What what do you need? Lord, I need you, but I've got nothing to give you. So my question to the Lord on the altar, asking him to save me, was, Lord, I don't know what else to do. That was the exact words. I remember them vividly. It was 55 years ago, but I still remember them. Lord, I don't know what else to do. I had totally given up, given myself over to the Lord, and he came on the scene. You answer those questions, what do you need and what have you got, maybe helps you totally give it over to the Lord. I don't know. And who am I to tell you how to, and I hope this doesn't come across that I'm trying to tell you how to live your life, or I'm trying to tell you how to pray, or how I'm trying to tell you how to have a relationship with the Lord, because I'm not. But I'm just telling you how it works for me. And I suspect that it'll be something similar for everybody here as it is for me, because I don't think mine and the Lord's relationship is unique in that regard. So he asked her those 2 questions. And then, I don't have anything except just a pot of oil in the house. All right. He told her, you know, and I'm going to go back just for a minute. You know, Proverbs. Yeah, it's in Proverbs, I'm pretty sure. No, I'm wrong. It's in Job. Job said this. Man that is born of woman is but a few days and full of trouble. So even, and Job, historians will tell you, was one of the very first books written. So Job lived a long time ago. So But even in those days, man that is born of woman is a few days. If we live to be 85, we've lived a long life today. And yeah, life has its troubles. Even Job knew it way back then. But he told her then, he said, go borrow vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, and even empty vessels borrow not a few. So basically what he was doing is he was asking her to step out on faith. Now think about this. Put yourself in her shoes. Now her neighbors no doubt knew her situation, I would think. Knew that she was poor, knew she was in trouble, knew she was in debt, knew she had no way to pay off her debt. Her husband had died. They knew all this stuff. So when she goes to send her, what do you think her boys, and I don't know, your idea is as good as mine, but what do you think her boys said to the neighbors when they went? Said, Mom said for me to come borrow your empty vessels. And they said, well, what do you need them for? What was their answer? I don't know what they said. Did they say, I don't know, Mom just told me to get them? Or was their answer, the Lord has use for them? I don't know. Something in between. I don't know what they said. But just think about that. But also think about this. There's two other verses of Scripture I want to get right here. Let me think for them. I want to do Proverbs first. Proverbs 15:3. If you ever think that God has deserted you, read these two verses of Scripture. First one's Proverbs 15:3. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. Don't think that the Lord's not watching your life. Don't ever think that the Lord doesn't understand and realize that you're going through a tough time right now. The Lord, I don't know, He's God. He can do whatever. He sees everybody. He sees. Gunnar, when you're in ninth grade? You're in ninth grade at Barron County High School. There's some child in ninth grade in Moscow, Russia. He sees him and he sees you. He knows everything, and that used to kind of help me a little bit keep myself in line. Because, I'm human. I was pretty mischievous I was quite mischievous as a boy. Put Mike Phillips and me together and we'd always get in trouble. But regardless of that, but in back of my mind is I would never forget the Lord's watching you. The Lord's watching you. He is. But the good part of that is He's also watching you when you go through the tough times. He's there. He knows. He's watching. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. There's so many wonderful verses in the Bible, but boy, this ranks right up there. 1 Peter 5 and 7. He knows everything about you now. Casting all your care upon Him, for He careth for you. He cares. I'm reminded of the prophets of Baal right at this moment of time. How they were trying to call upon their gods and to come down with fire and lick up to consume the sacrifice there. That was with Elijah. By the way, just a little insert here. You remember when Elisha asked Elijah? Elijah said, "What can I do for you?" And Elisha said, "Give me a double portion of thy spirit." If you'll study the histories of those two men, Elisha and Elijah, Elisha's ministry was about twice as long as Elijah's, and the number of Elisha's miracles were about twice the number of Elijah's miracles. So the Lord literally gave him a double portion. But anyway, on the prophets of Baal, if you remember that they were praying and they were calling upon him and crying and upon their gods and even cutting their wrist and they were bleeding and everything and he just ignored them. But when Elijah called on his God and our God, he answered immediately. Now, in this case, he answered immediately. Mike, you touched on it in Sunday school and you're 100% right. Lots of times prayers are delayed. You can pray the prayer today, God recognizes and realizes, and it might get answered 50 years from now, depending on what the prayer is and what the need is. I don't know. But remember, God knows and He cares. You can preach a whole sermon on the love of God. In fact, I've tried to do it a time or two before, There's never been a time I've preached on the love of God that I have sat down and felt like that I did a good job of fulfilling sharing how much God really loves us, because I just can't do it. He loves us more than you love your children. He loves us more than your parents loved you. Ever how much that was. He does. But anyway, let me get back to this. He sees and he cares. Don't ever forget that. Then he said, go and borrow the vessels or borrow from the neighbors, even the empty vessels, borrow not a few. All right. So she had to do something. Now, sometimes in our prayers and in our relationship with the Lord, it requires more than just praying. Sometimes you got to move. Sometimes you got to put legs on those prayers, depending on what the situation is. Not always, but sometimes you do. In this case, she did. He said, "I want you to go. I want you to do something." And when you've got that done, you've come in. I want you to shut the door upon thee. So anyway, let me get back to witnessing here just real quick. So when she went and asked the neighbors for those vessels, or her sons did, as I said earlier, I don't know exactly what they said, but that was a way of a public confession, especially when the way it all ended. Now, at the time that they were loaning her those vessels, I'm sure they didn't have a clue what it was for or what was going to happen. But after the fact, even her neighbors were able to look back on it and see how God blessed her. And then at that point in time, it was a witness to her neighbors. It was a public witness. All right. In this case, then it come down to a time of privacy between just her and her family and God. And sometimes it comes down to just me and God, just you and God. Sometimes it comes down to that. And I want you to know, I don't know that there's a sweeter time on earth. Not when I'm talking to God, but when God is talking to me. And He will. He does. And that is a peace that passeth all understanding. Doesn't happen as often as it could, because I get in the way. Doesn't happen as often as I would like for it to. You know what? Again, as I said earlier, I'm kind of an open book. I'll tell you where it happens to me as much as any place, and that's driving down the road listening to gospel music. Where it happens as much. I'm going to get back to this in a minute. I don't believe God would put this little story on my mind if He didn't want me to share it with you this morning, so I'm going to. I was working, of course, most of you know I work for Berkman, and most of the time I'm in the office doing rations and stuff like that, office work. But sometimes I need to get out on the road and travel and visit farms and so on, and I enjoy that part of the job, and I do that. I was working in Clinton County one day, and driving down the road and listening to gospel music. I love Pandora and Spotify, and I've got a son that knows how to make playlists for me of the songs I like, and I don't know how to do it, but he does. And so Blaine makes my playlist for me, and I was listening to gospel music, and I mean, it just started bubbling up. Now, it's kind of like I could take you back to the spot where I was saved. I could take you back to the spot on that road where it started bubbling up. And my goodness, the Lord blessed me. I'm not a shouter. Not many people are anymore. I think I did that day. Was crying. I guess I kept my hands on the steering wheel, but I really don't know. Surely I did. But I mean, I just lost my whole surroundings. I didn't have a clue. I mean, goodness gracious. The Lord can bless us like that every once in a while. And as the song says, blessed assurance, what did it say? What did it say? Let me turn back to it real, because I won't get the wording just right. I know if I don't read it again. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine that was. And you can have that with the Lord here on this side of eternity. You can. I mean, I got to move on, though. I don't want to wear your patience. So anyway, he told her, he said, go in and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And I started to read it this way, and I thought, no, I'm going to read just the way the King James Version says it. And she poured out, and she poured out, and she poured out, and she poured out, and she poured out. And it came to pass, the vessels were full. You know what? You know, in doing my work, there's fractions of each of these categories, but I look at protein and energy in growing cattle. You got to have enough protein, got to have enough energy, and how they fit together and so on. And what way I refer to that when I'm discussing that with a customer or prospect is I refer to it as your first limiting factor. In other words, you got enough energy for your calf to gain 3 pounds a day, but you just got enough protein for it to gain 2 pounds a day. So your first limiting factor is protein. You know, it's how I phrase that. And so I can't help but when I read this think about what's your first limiting factor. You know what our first limiting factor was? The number of vessels our neighbors had. It wasn't God. It wasn't God. It was how many vessels could she collect is what it was. Because he filled every one of them. And you know what he said on the last, he said, in the 7th verse, he said this, go and sell the oil and pay thy debt. Great, right? Get your sons back, pay your debt. He didn't stop there. I'm telling you, best paid master you ever worked for is God. He didn't stop there. He said, and live thou and thy children of the rest. In other words, you got enough here. Here's your retirement, dear. You got all you need for the rest of your life. Right here. Right here. God knows what you're going through. God knows what I'm going through. And he cares. You know, that's to me, that's the thing that hits me the hardest. I mean, he really sincerely cares. You might think he doesn't sometimes. You know, there's been things that were tough for me to get through occasionally. If I look back on it now, it helped mold me into the person I am today because I went through that. You know, sometimes it works like that. Not every time, but sometimes it does. Sometimes it does. You know, I've got a little. I'm gonna tell this too. It's a little humorous story, and there's nothing wrong with, in proper way, proper place. There's nothing wrong with humor in church now. But there's two gentlemen were trout fishing in the stream, and next to each other, didn't know each other, but they were fishing. They were having a lot of success catching fish. Well, one of them, if he would catch a fish, he would take out a little 8-inch ruler and measure it. And if the fish was greater than 8 inches, he'd put it back. If it was smaller than 8 inches, he would keep it. Went on that way all day long. They came to the end of the day, and they had their fish and get ready to leave. And the one gentleman said, I've been watching you all day long throw back those big fish and keep the little ones. He said, why are you doing that? He said, I've just got an 8-inch frying pan. Well, I say that to say this. Don't limit the Lord to an 8-inch frying pan. If you don't remember anything else about this sermon, remember that little story there. Don't limit the Lord to an 8-inch frying pan. Folks, he's got as big a frying pan as the biggest fish you can catch. If you just let him do it. Let him use it. I think I'm done. Mike, I don't come out here often enough anymore to know, but we're going to sing a song today, whether you normally do or not, toward the end. And if you don't care, sing 25.